Captain Frederick C. Blesse signed the form at 04:52 hours on the morning of June 19, 1952, and the ink smeared because his hands hadn't stopped shaking. The victory credit claim, air to air, sat on the intelligence officer's desk at Suwon Air Base, K-13, 3 pages of carbon copy bureaucracy demanding altitude, airspeed, bearing, rounds expended, and confirmation witnesses for each of 3 separate MiG-15 kills. 3. The intelligence officer, a first lieutenant named Rawlings, stared at the timestamp on the form, then at the operations board behind him, then back at Blesse. The board didn't list Blesse as having flown that morning. It didn't list anyone from the 34th Fighter Interceptor Squadron as having flown that morning. This story almost disappeared into a filing cabinet at 5th Air Force Headquarters, Nagoya. Most people have never heard of Fred Blesse's 3-kill morning, and the Air Force didn't go out of its way to publicize it. A like and subscribe keeps stories like this one from vanishing a second time. Drop a comment if triple kills before breakfast sounds like something worth investigating. Because Rawlings had a problem. The claim form listed engagement times starting at 04:19, which put the first kill approximately 7 minutes before nautical twilight. Squadron operations had scheduled no dawn patrol for the 34th that day. The duty roster showed Blesse on a rest cycle after flying 2 missions the previous afternoon, the second of which had put 2 20mm cannon rounds through his F-86's left wing root fairing, damage that maintenance hadn't yet cleared. So here stood a captain, unscheduled, in a damaged aircraft that should have been grounded, filing paperwork for 3 aerial victories scored in semi-darkness over the Yalu River. Rawlings did what any good intelligence officer does when confronted with something that makes no administrative sense. He poured coffee, found a blank debriefing form, and started writing. The debriefing transcript runs 11 pages. 5th Air Force declassified it in 1977, and it sat in the National Archives for decades before anyone connected it to Blesse's published memoir, which glosses over the episode in 2 paragraphs. The transcript tells a different story. Blesse's voice on the page, transcribed by Rawlings with occasional parenthetical notes like subject rubbing eyes and long pause, carries the flat, over-caffeinated tone of a man describing something he doesn't fully believe he did. He refers to the first MiG as the one I almost hit with my wing, and the third as the one that shouldn't count. Rawlings, to his credit, pressed him on everything. Airspeed at merge, sun angle, whether he could positively distinguish MiG-15s from MiG-9s at that light level. Blesse's answer to the light level question occupies a full paragraph of the transcript and boils down to, he couldn't, not with certainty, not until the first one caught fire, and he saw the swept wing platform illuminated against the Yalu's surface. That detail matters more than it seems. The swept wing told him these weren't older straight-wing fighters being ferried north. They carried cannon and shot back. Gun camera footage from Blesse's F-86 confirmed 2 of the 3 kills. The third, the one that shouldn't count, broke apart after Blesse's burst hit the tail section, but the camera had run out of film 6 seconds earlier. Rawlings noted this in the margin of the claim form with the annotation, camera expenditure prior to 3rd engagement, no footage available. 5th Air Force eventually credited Blesse with 2 confirmed and 1 probable, which irritated him for the rest of his career. What the transcript doesn't explain, what Rawlings either didn't ask or chose not to record, is why Blesse launched at all. An unscheduled pilot in an uncleared aircraft at an hour when the runway lights at K-13 ran on reduced power to avoid attracting bedcheck Charlie harassment raids. The operations log for that morning shows no takeoff authorization. The tower communications log shows a single notation at 0408, F-86, 34th FIS, rolling without clearance. Someone at K-13 watched an F-86 Sabre taxi to the active runway in near total darkness and take off without permission, and all they did about it filled 1 line in a logbook. The answer to why starts 12 hours earlier, in a tent behind the officers' club, with a bottle of Suntory whiskey and a radio intercept that nobody in intelligence took seriously. The Suntory bottle had a crack running down one side, sealed with a strip of olive drab tape that someone had labeled "Structural Repair, Do Not Pressurize" in grease pencil. It sat on an ammunition crate between two canvas chairs in the intelligence tent at Kimpo, K-14, home of the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing, and it had been half empty since Tuesday. Kimpo ran differently than Suwon. The 4th owned the lion's share of F-86 Sabres in theater, which meant it also owned the lion's share of maintenance headaches, sortie quotas, and paperwork. The base processed more victory credit claims than any installation in the Korean theater, sometimes 6 or 7 per day during peak MiG alley rotations, and each one required a chain of documentation that would have impressed a tax attorney. Gun camera film, developed and time-stamped. Wingman confirmation, signed and witnessed. Intelligence officer assessment cross-referenced against radar plots from Chodo Island's ground control intercept station. Flight surgeon certification that the claiming pilot hadn't exceeded his monthly combat hours limitation. And a narrative reconstruction of the engagement, written in third person, as though the whole thing had happened to someone else. Why third person? Because 5th Air Force's Judge Advocate General had decided in late 1951 that first-person accounts introduced subjective emotional bias into the record. So, a pilot who'd just survived a 4G scissors fight at 42,000 feet over the Yalu had to sit down and write something like, "Captain Smith then observed the enemy aircraft enter a left descending spiral." The RAF had wrestled with nearly identical problems during the Battle of Britain, where Fighter Command's insistence on requiring 2 independent confirmations per kill led to chronic undercounting during the large-scale engagements over London in September 1940. Park's controllers at 11 Group eventually relaxed the standard to 1 witness plus wreckage, or 1 witness plus camera, which inflated some numbers but kept pilots from spending more time on paperwork than in cockpits. The Americans in Korea landed on a middle ground that satisfied nobody. 1 witness plus camera for confirmed, 1 witness without camera for probable, camera alone without witness for damaged, which brings us back to Kimpo's intelligence tent on the evening of June 18th. The tent smelled like JP4 and mimeograph ink, a combination that Lieutenant James P. Hagerstrom of the 67th Fighter Bomber Squadron later described in a letter home as "what the future smells like if the future has a headache." Hagerstrom had stopped by to drop off his own claim paperwork, a MiG-15, damaged over Sinwiju that afternoon, and found Blesse sitting in one of the canvas chairs, drinking from the cracked Suntory bottle and reading a mimeographed sheet that didn't belong to him. The sheet carried a classification stamp. Blesse shouldn't have had it. It originated from the 6,000 4th Air Intelligence Service Squadron, the signals intelligence outfit that monitored Soviet and Chinese radio traffic from a cluster of Quonset huts near Kimpo's eastern perimeter. The document summarized 3 days of intercepted communications between Antung Airfield, the main MiG base across the Yalu in Manchuria, and what analysts believed to be a Soviet naval aviation regiment rotating in from Vladivostok. The intercepts indicated that the new regiment planned its first familiarization flights for the early morning hours of June 19th, before American combat air patrols typically reached MiG Alley. Flights of 4 aircraft, low altitude, no tactical formation, just orientation runs along the south bank of the Yalu to learn the terrain. Blesse read the sheet twice. Hagerstrom watched him fold it, slide it into his flight suit pocket, and take another drink. The intelligence staff at Kimpo had reviewed the same intercepts and assessed them as unconfirmed, likely deceptive. Their reasoning filled 2 paragraphs of analysis that amounted to a single judgment. The Soviets wouldn't fly orientation missions in daylight, period. Blesse disagreed, 14-1. That ratio, American kills to American losses in air-to-air combat over MiG Alley, circulated through every fighter squadron in Korea by mid-1952, and Blesse knew it as well as he knew his own aircraft number. But the ratio lied, or at least it omitted. It counted only engagements where F-86s met MiG-15s in the 30-mile corridor between the Chongchon River and the Yalu. The number left out MiGs that bounced F-80s and F-84s on fighter bomber runs farther south, where the numbers looked uglier. It also ignored the MiGs that crossed back into Manchurian airspace before a Sabre pilot could close to firing range. Roughly 40% of all radar contacts, according to the Chodo Island GCI logs. Days when MiGs simply didn't show up further inflated sortie counts without adding engagements. Strip all that away, and the effective kill ratio in contested airspace dropped closer to 7-1. Dominant? Yes. The best air-to-air performance by any fighter force since the Marianas Turkey shoot. But 7-1 against an airplane that could outclimb the Sabre by nearly 2,000 feet per minute demanded explanation, not celebration. So what explained it? The MiG-15 carried two 23mm cannon and one 37mm cannon, all mounted in the lower nose. Heavy armament designed to shred B-29 bombers, not dogfight nimble swept-wing fighters. The 37mm fired slowly, roughly 400 rounds per minute, and its trajectory dropped like a mortar shell beyond 600 yards. The Sabre's 650 caliber machine guns threw a denser pattern at longer range, which meant an American pilot could open fire earlier in a tracking solution and sustain hits through a wider cone. Rate of fire mattered more than shell weight in a turning fight. The MiG's cannon arrangement also produced asymmetric recoil that yawed the nose left on firing, a characteristic Soviet pilots trained to compensate for but never fully eliminated. Colonel Yevgeny Pepelyaev, commanding the 196th Fighter Aviation Regiment out of Antung, later wrote that his pilots spent an unreasonable number of training hours learning to anticipate the yaw. His word, unreasonable. American intelligence didn't have access to Pepelyev's assessment until the mid-1990s, but Sabre pilots observed the effect in real time. MiGs that opened fire at distance tended to scatter rounds left of the target. MiGs that closed to point-blank range hit accurately, but exposed themselves to the Sabre's superior roll rate. The Sabre rolled faster. That single aerodynamic fact killed more MiG pilots than any tactical doctrine. At 400 knots indicated airspeed, an F-86 could complete a full 360-degree roll in approximately 1.4 seconds. The MiG-15 took closer to 2.2 seconds at the same speed. In a scissors fight, two aircraft crossing back and forth, each trying to force the other to overshoot, that 0.8 of a second compounded geometrically across reversals. By the third or fourth reversal, the Sabre pilot sat behind the MiG with a tracking solution. Soviet tactical manuals from the period acknowledged this deficit obliquely, instructing pilots to avoid prolonged maneuvering engagements below 8,000 meters. Above that altitude, the MiG's lighter wing loading gave it the advantage in sustained turns, so experienced Soviet flight leaders dragged fights upward whenever possible. Pepelyev's regiment enforced a hard floor of 10,000 meters for initial engagements, roughly 33,000 feet. American pilots called it going upstairs, and most of them hated it because the Sabre's hydraulic flight controls stiffened at altitude, reducing the roll rate advantage that kept them alive down low. Blesse flew at 26,000 feet or below whenever he could. His personal notes from that spring, handwritten on the backs of maintenance forms, because apparently blank paper ran short at K-13, show a pilot obsessed with getting beneath the MiG's preferred engagement envelope. Force them down and make them turn, burn energy in the thick air where the Sabre's engine breathed better and the controls stayed light. The intelligence analysts at Kimpo dismissed the signal's intercept because it described low-altitude orientation flights, the kind of mission no Soviet regiment would risk in contested airspace. Blesse read the same intercept and saw something else entirely. MiGs flying exactly where he wanted them, at exactly the altitude where his airplane held every card. How much had he actually drunk? The Suntory bottle held 700 milliliters when full. Hagerström's letter home estimates it stood at roughly a third when he arrived at the intelligence tent, and Blesse had been drinking alone for at least an hour before that. Hagerström joined him. By the time Blesse folded the intercept sheet into his flight suit and walked out into the evening heat at Kimpo, the bottle held a finger's width. Split between two men over perhaps 90 minutes, that puts consumption somewhere around a third of a bottle each. 4, maybe 5 generous pours of Japanese whiskey on an empty stomach in a canvas tent that had been baking since noon. Blesse drove a jeep back to K-13, 47 miles of unpaved Korean road in the dark, half-drunk, with a classified document in his pocket. The records don't say whether anyone rode with him. K-13's flight surgeon, Captain Morris Grunwald, kept meticulous notes. His daily log for June 18th lists Blesse as having reported to the dispensary at 22:15 hours for complaint of headache and nausea, likely secondary to fatigue and dehydration. Grunwald prescribed aspirin and fluids. The log entry includes a line that 5th Air Force medical reviewers later flagged with a red grease pencil checkmark. Pilot presence with mild alcohol odor. Advised 12-hour stand-down from flight status per AFR 35-16. Grunwald wrote advised. He didn't write grounded or restricted. The distinction mattered because AFR 35-16 gave flight surgeons discretionary authority to ground pilots. But exercising that authority required filling out a grounding form that went into the pilot's permanent file. Grunwald, by all available evidence, liked Blesse. He chose the softer verb, so did Blesse comply? He walked out of the dispensary at approximately 22:30, which meant the 12-hour advisory window wouldn't expire until 10:30 the following morning. He took off at 04:08. That put him roughly 6 hours into a 12-hour stand-down, flying an aircraft with uncleared battle damage, on a mission nobody had authorized, based on intelligence that the professionals had rejected. Why didn't someone stop him? This question bothered 5th Air Force's Inspector General enough to generate a 4-page inquiry in August 1952. The inquiry found that K-13's night duty officer, a second lieutenant from the maintenance squadron, heard the engine start on the flight line at approximately 03:50 and assumed it belonged to a scheduled ground run. The tower operator on duty saw the Sabre taxi but recognized the aircraft number as belonging to the 34th and assumed operations had authorized a mission he hadn't been briefed on. 2 assumptions, both wrong, both reasonable, in isolation. The Inspector General's report uses the phrase procedural gap 3 times in 4 pages, which translates from military bureaucratese into something simpler. Nobody owned the problem. Blesse climbed out of K-13, heading 340 northwest toward the Yalu at 0408 on a morning when the horizon hadn't separated from the ground yet. 2 patched cannon holes in the left wing, Suntory in the bloodstream, and in his pocket a classified intercept that 3 intelligence analysts had called fake. 0547. Blesse had been airborne for an hour and 39 minutes, most of it spent in a slow orbit at 22,000 feet over the mouth of the Chongchan, burning fuel he couldn't afford to waste. The Sabre's J-47 engine drank kerosene at roughly 110 gallons per hour in cruise configuration, and K-13 sat 160 nautical miles to the southeast. He had maybe 40 minutes of loiter time before the math turned ugly. The sun cracked the eastern horizon at 0544. 3 minutes later, Blesse's radar warning receiver stayed silent. The MiG-15 carried no radar, but his eyes didn't. 4 silver shapes, line abreast, crossing the Yalu at what he estimated as 12,000 feet, heading south-southeast along the river's western bend. No combat spread, no stagger, no weave, no sign they expected contact. They flew like students on a cross-country navigation exercise, and that appears to be what they were. The Soviet Naval Aviation Rotation Program that funneled pilots through Manchuria operated on a cycle that 5th Air Force intelligence never fully mapped during the war. Declassified Soviet records from the 1990s show that regiments typically deployed for 60 to 90 days, overlapping with the outgoing unit by roughly 2 weeks. During that overlap, the incoming pilots flew familiarization sorties, terrain orientation, airfield approach patterns, communications checks with Chinese ground controllers who spoke Russian with varying degrees of competence. The Luftwaffe had run a similar transition scheme on the Eastern Front, rotating Jagdgeschwader units through forward airfields in 45-day cycles and losing a disproportionate number of pilots during the first week at each new posting. General-Lieutenant Adolf Galland attributed 17% of fighter losses in 1943 to what he called geographic disorientation during acclimatization. Pilots who knew how to fly and fight but didn't yet know where they were. The Soviet naval aviators crossing the Yalu on the morning of June 19th faced that identical vulnerability, compounded by an assumption that no American fighters patrolled MiG Alley before 0600. Blesse pushed over into a descent that took him through 18,000 feet at 420 knots, converting altitude into speed in a shallow left turn that put the sun directly behind him. Standard bounce geometry: come out of the sun, close fast, fire before they react. He had practiced this approach against F-80s playing the role of MiGs during training rotations at Nellis, and the muscle memory held even through the dull headache that had followed him since K-13. The patched cannon holes in his left wing created a slight asymmetric drag that pulled the nose 2 degrees left in a dive. He trimmed it out with rudder and kept closing. At 0548, he passed through 15,000 feet, 3 miles behind the trailing MiG on the far right of the formation. The Soviet pilot sources conflict on whether this aircraft belonged to the 781st or 783rd Fighter Aviation Regiment, held steady course and altitude. He didn't break turn, didn't jettison external tanks, didn't call his flight leader, at least not on any frequency the 6004th's intercept operators recorded. Blesse's gun sight Pipper settled on the MiG's fuselage just forward of the tail. He opened fire at approximately 800 yards and held the trigger for a 2-second burst, roughly 160 rounds from 6 guns, converging on a target that filled his windscreen and grew larger with every 1/10 of a second. The gun camera film from this burst survived. It shows pieces separating from the MiG's aft fuselage beginning at frame 47 of the sequence. Metal panels, a chunk of horizontal stabilizer, something dark that could be hydraulic fluid vaporizing in the slipstream. The MiG rolled left and pitched nose down without any apparent control input. Blesse released the trigger, pulled 4 Gs to avoid the debris field, and looked for the remaining 3 aircraft. They had scattered. 2 broke hard, right toward Manchurian airspace. 1 broke left and down, descending through 10,000 feet in what appeared to be a panicked split S that bled energy catastrophically. Lieutenant Charles D. Owens flew the dawn patrol out of Kimpo that morning and arrived over the Yalu at 0551, 3 minutes after Blesse opened fire. Owens saw the descending MiG, saw Blesse's Sabre rolling in behind it, and later wrote in his debrief that the engagement looked like a hawk chasing a pigeon that had forgotten it could turn. Owens didn't intervene. He orbited at 25,000 feet and watched. 3 in 1 sortie is either a lie or a miracle. Colonel Harrison Thing wrote that in the margins of Blesse's after-action report, then signed the confirmation line beneath it. The second MiG, the one that split S'd into the thick air below 10,000 feet, died because its pilot made the exact mistake Papelyev's training doctrine existed to prevent. He went low. He went slow. And he stayed in a turn. Blesse followed him through 9,000 feet, 7,000, 5,000, the altimeter unwinding as both aircraft bled into the humid air over the Korean coastline, where the Sabre's engine ran fat and happy on dense oxygen, while the MiG's VK-1 engine, optimized for altitude, lost thrust it couldn't recover. The smell of cordite had already filled Blesse's cockpit from the first burst. Unfiltered gun gas bleeding back through the ammunition feed ports in the nose, acrid enough to make his eyes water. He fired again at 6,000 feet, a 3-second burst at 500 yards that struck the MiG's left wing root. The gun camera caught the wing folding upward at an angle. Wings don't fold. Frame 112 shows the canopy separating. Frame 114 shows a dark shape, the pilot ejecting, clearing the fuselage as the aircraft came apart around him. Soviet records list this pilot as Senior Lieutenant Anatoly Karasev. He survived. His parachute carried him into Chinese-held territory north of Sinuiju, and he returned to Antung with a broken collarbone and burns on both hands. Blesse pulled up hard, bleeding speed for altitude, and the third MiG appeared because it had made the only reasonable decision available. It had turned back. One of the two aircraft that broke right toward Manchuria reversed course and came south again, apparently to cover Karasev's ejection, or, less charitably, because the flight leader radioed an order the pilot couldn't refuse. Why would a pilot fly back into a fight he'd just fled? The answer sits in a 1993 interview with former Soviet naval aviator Viktor Larionov, who served with the 783rd during this rotation. Larionov described a command culture where abandoning a wingman carried consequences worse than combat. Court-martial meant Siberia, Larionov told the interviewer. A MiG could only kill you. The third engagement lasted 11 seconds. Blesse caught the returning MiG in a shallow climbing turn at 8,000 feet, both aircraft heading roughly northwest. The MiG pilot saw him. The aircraft began a brake turn to the right, but initiated it too late and too gently, pulling maybe 3 Gs when survival required 6. Blesse's pipper tracked across the MiG's belly from tail to nose. He pressed the trigger and held it until the guns went dry on 4 of his 6 50s. The gun camera film from this pass shows impacts walking forward along the fuselage in a tight grouping that the 4th Wing's intelligence officer described in his analysis as consistent with a stabilized tracking solution at optimal range. Bureaucratic language for a perfect shot. The MiG's engine exploded at frame 209, not a fire, but a structural failure. The turbine section disintegrating and punching fragments through the upper fuselage skin. No ejection, no parachute. The aircraft entered a flat spin trailing black smoke and disappeared below Blesse's left wing. The engagement log timestamps the final burst at 05:53, 6 minutes. 4 MiGs engaged, 3 destroyed, 1 escaped into Manchuria. Blesse's ammunition counter showed 114 rounds remaining across 2 functioning guns. Owens, still orbiting above, keyed his radio and said something the transcript records as garbled. His debrief reconstructed it as a single word repeated twice. Blesse didn't respond. He turned southeast toward K-13 with fuel gauges showing numbers that left no margin for a missed approach. The headache had gotten worse. His hands shook on the stick, adrenaline dump mixing with whatever the Suntory had left behind in his nervous system. Below him, 2 columns of smoke marked the water where the MiGs had gone in, 0622. Blesse's Sabre touched down at K-13 with fuel for maybe 4 more minutes of flight. He taxied to the revetment, shut down the J-47, and sat in the cockpit for what the crew chief later estimated as 2 full minutes before climbing out. The crew chief, Staff Sergeant Raymond Okada, noticed the gun ports first, carbon scoring around 4 of the 6 muzzle openings. The blast panels blackened in a pattern that only appeared after sustained firing. Okada had serviced this aircraft for 5 months. He counted the empty ammunition bays and did arithmetic that didn't match any scheduled mission. K-13's operations desk received Blesse's victory claim form at 0631. The duty officer, First Lieutenant William Herrick, looked at the form, looked at the flight board, looked at the form again. Blesse's name didn't appear on the board, no mission number existed for his sortie, no wingman had been assigned. The takeoff time listed, 0408, predated the first scheduled launch by nearly 2 hours. Herrick picked up the field telephone and called the 4th Wing Operations Center at Kimpo, 14 miles north, because K-13's 34th Squadron fell under Kimpo's tactical authority, and Herrick understood that whatever had happened belonged several pay grades above his own. At Kimpo, the operations duty officer was Major Gerald Grubb. Grubb's phone log, preserved in the 4th Wing's operational records at the National Archives, shows the call from K-13 arriving at 0638. Grubb's handwritten notation reads, Blesse claims 3 MiG-15 destroyed, no frag order, no auth, unscheduled departure. K-13 0408, gun camera film en route. Beneath that, in smaller letters, what the hell? So, what does a fighter wings operations center do when a pilot who shouldn't have been flying delivers results that shouldn't exist? It does what military bureaucracies always do. It generates paper. Grubb initiated a standard kill confirmation sequence that required gun camera review, debrief transcription, radar correlation from the 6004th Air Intelligence Service Squadron, and independent witness statements. That last requirement presented an immediate problem. Blesse had flown alone. No wingman, no element partner. A violation of standing operating procedure so fundamental that Grubb initially assumed the form contained an error. Owens fixed that problem. His arrival over the Yalu at 0551 and his subsequent debrief provided the independent corroboration that Grubb needed, though Owens hadn't participated in the engagement and could only confirm what he'd observed from 25,000 feet. His statement describes two separate fire and maneuver sequences resulting in two aircraft impacts on water, and one additional aircraft observed descending with visible structural damage. Pilot ejection confirmed. Owens signed the statement at 0815. By then, Colonel Thing had been woken up, briefed, and was standing in the intelligence section at Kimpo, reading Blesse's after-action report with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. Thing faced a command decision that contained no good options. Validate the kills, and he endorsed an unauthorized combat sortie flown by a pilot who had violated a medical stand-down, departed without clearance, crossed into airspace he had no orders to enter, and done it all in an aircraft carrying uncleared battle damage. Reject the kills, and the gun camera film, already being developed in the photolab, would prove him wrong within hours. The film didn't care about procedure. The intelligence analysts who had dismissed the signal's intercept learned about the kills at 0745 when the morning briefing at Kimpo opened with Grubb's summary. The declassified briefing notes show that Captain Alan Reeves, the senior analyst who had written the two-paragraph rejection of the intercept's validity, requested a copy of the original document for re-evaluation in light of operational developments. That phrasing comes directly from the briefing minutes. Reeves wanted another look at the piece of paper he'd called fabricated 16 hours earlier, because 3 burning MiGs had just called it authentic. Thing's marginal note on the after-action report, the one about lies and miracles, came later that morning, after the gun camera review confirmed all 3 kills. He signed the confirmation. He also initiated a formal inquiry into the unauthorized sortie, because signing one form didn't excuse the need for the other. The Air Force could celebrate a triple ace sortie and investigate the pilot who flew it at the same time. Bureaucracy, as always, contained multitudes. Captain Alan Reeves carried the original signal's intercept from the filing cabinet to the light table at 0840 and read it again from the beginning. Same document, same frequencies, same timestamps, same assessment of Soviet orientation flights departing Antung at dawn. 16 hours earlier, he had written the word fabricated in red grease pencil across the routing slip. The grease pencil mark still showed through the onion skin paper, a smear of red sitting directly above the line that read, estimated departure window 0530 to 0600 local. Blesse's gun camera film arrived at the Kimpo Photolab at 0755. Hand-carried by a courier in a jeep who had driven 14 miles with the canister between his knees. The lab technicians developed 3 strips of 16mm film totaling 412 frames. 1 strip per firing pass, and every one of them showed a MiG-15 coming apart. Reeves viewed the film at 0910 in a screening room that smelled of developing chemicals and stale cigarettes, the acrid bite of fixer solution hanging in air that the ventilation system couldn't clear. He watched it twice. The second viewing, he brought a notepad. He didn't write anything on it. What do you do when the evidence destroys your professional judgment? Reeves had 17 months of intelligence work in theater. He held a reputation for careful analysis, for refusing to validate claims that lacked corroboration. His rejection of the intercept followed established methodology. Soviet units didn't fly low-altitude familiarization sorties in contested airspace during previous rotations. So this intercept describing exactly that pattern read as disinformation or garble. Sound reasoning built on incomplete data. The declassified after-action review notes that Reeves's methodology followed accepted analytical standards, but failed to account for evolving enemy operational patterns. A polite way of saying he got it wrong. Thing screened the film at 0930. He watched it once, asked the photo officer to freeze frame 209, the turbine disintegration on the 3rd MiG, and studied it for several seconds. Then he turned to the intelligence staff assembled behind him. "Confirm all three. Full credit. And get me that intercept. I want to know why we didn't have 4 airplanes over the Yalu this morning instead of one drunk captain who stole his own jet." Reeves stood in the back of that room. The file doesn't record whether Thing knew he stood there. It probably didn't matter. The victory claim form sits in a cardboard folder at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, filed under 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing Operational Records, Box 17 of 43. The paper has yellowed to the color of weak tea. The smeared ink in the signature block, Blesse's hand, shaking from adrenaline and hangover, bled through to the reverse side, where someone stamped "confirmed" in block letters using red ink that has aged to the brown of dried blood. The form weighs almost nothing. It changed 3 men's careers. Blesse received official credit for 3 MiG-15s destroyed on June 19, 1952. The formal inquiry into his unauthorized sortie concluded on July 2nd with a finding of improper departure procedures and a recommendation for administrative action. Thing signed the finding. He also signed Blesse's recommendation for the Distinguished Flying Cross on the same desk, the same afternoon, using the same pen. Sources conflict on whether this represented calculated irony or simple efficiency. The 3rd MiG pilot, the one who turned back, never ejected. Soviet loss records from the 783rd 1EAP, partially declassified after 1991, list Lieutenant Dmitry Shchukin as killed in action on that date. He had arrived at Antung 11 days earlier. His flight log showed 47 hours in the MiG-15, all of them training sorties over Manchurian airspace where nothing shot back. Shchukin had a wife in Vladivostok named Yelena, and a daughter he referred to in letters as the Small Commander. He flew back into the fight because someone on the radio told him to, or because Karasev's parachute hung in the air below him, or because 23 years of Soviet military culture had replaced the instinct for self-preservation with something harder to name. He pulled 3 Gs when he needed 6. That gap killed him. Karasev survived. He returned to operational flying after 8 weeks of recovery, transferred to a PVO interceptor regiment in the Leningrad Military District in 1953, and retired as a colonel in 1974. His memoirs, published in a limited Russian-language edition in 1988, dedicate one paragraph to June 19th. He describes the engagement as an ambush by multiple enemy aircraft, plural, not singular. Either he believed more than one Sabre attacked the formation, or he chose not to record the alternative. The alternative carried implications about Soviet training and equipment, about tactical doctrine that a colonel writing under Gorbachev's glasnost still couldn't put on paper. Reeves submitted a revised assessment of the signals intercept on June 21st, 48 hours after the engagement. The revised document runs 6 pages, 4 more than his original rejection. It recommended establishing a dedicated watch team for Soviet rotation period communications, with authority to task reconnaissance assets based on intercept analysis alone, without requiring corroboration from other sources. The recommendation went to 5th Air Force Headquarters at Nagoya. The declassified routing slip shows it reached the Intelligence Directorate on June 30th. The response field on the slip contains a date stamp, July 14th, and nothing else. No approval, no rejection. The file holds no further correspondence. Blesse flew 67 more combat missions before rotating home in October 1952. He finished the war with 10 confirmed kills, enough for ace status twice over. He wrote a tactical manual called No Guts, No Glory that became required reading at the Fighter Weapons School at Nellis for the next 15 years, a document built on the premise that American pilots held advantages their training should maximize rather than constrain. The manual never mentions the Zuntori. It never mentions the intercept, Reeves, the pre-dawn theft of his own aircraft. What it does contain on page 47 is a single sentence about the value of acting on imperfect intelligence. A pilot who waits for certainty will wait until someone else has done the fighting. Shchukin's daughter turned 4 that August. The notification letter from the 783rd Octa AP reached Vladivostok by military post on June 28, 9 days after the engagement. The regimental commander's letter described her father's death as occurring during the fulfillment of international duty. The after-action report filed at Antung listed the cause as engine failure during a training sortie over the Yellow Sea, no enemy contact, aircraft unrecoverable. The gun camera film at College Park tells a different story. Frame 209 still holds the light of Shukin's engine coming apart, frozen mid